The gun was already pressed against Isaac Watkins's chest before Virginia Dalton even had time to scream. She stood frozen in the doorway of the Redemption Creek General Store, her basket of flour and dried beans clutched against her ribs, watching as three men in dusters pinned the drifter she barely knew against the wooden counter with the kind of practiced ease that told her this was not their first ambush. The tallest of the three, a man with a jaw like a shovel blade and eyes the color of muddy river water, pressed the barrel of his revolver directly over Isaac's heart and smiled the way rattlesnakes smile before they strike. "Thought you could just ride into a new town and we would not find you, Watkins," the tall man said. "You are a hard man to kill, but not as hard as you think." Isaac did not beg. He did not flinch. He stood perfectly still with his hands slightly raised and his jaw set in a line so rigid it might have been carved from the same limestone that made up the canyon walls surrounding Redemption Creek. There was something in his eyes that stopped Virginia cold, something she had never seen in a man's face before. It was not fear, it was not defiance. It was exhaustion, the bone-deep, soul-hollowing kind that comes from running so long a person forgets what they were running from in the first place. "You are right," Isaac said quietly. "I am tired of running." The tall man cocked the hammer. Virginia's basket hit the floor. Flour exploded across the sun-warped boards, and she lunged forward without a single thought for her own safety, grabbing the iron skillet hanging from its hook on the nearest wall and bringing it across the back of the tall man's skull with everything she had. The crack of it rang through the store like a rifle shot. The tall man's knees buckled. The gun went off, but the bullet found the ceiling, and the other two men scrambled backward in the confusion. And in that half-second of chaos, Isaac Watkins moved, fast and precise, disarming the second man with a twist that looked almost bored before planting his boot against the third one's chest and sending him backward through the screen door and out into the red dirt street. The whole thing was over in 12 seconds. Virginia stood among the spilled flour and shattered glass from a jar of pickles, breathing hard, the skillet still in her hand, her dark hair coming loose from its pins. Isaac stared at her. The tall man groaned and slumped sideways. The two others had already taken off running down Main Street. "You could have been killed," Isaac said, and his voice was the strangest thing she had heard all year, equal parts amazement and something raw and helpless. "You could have been killed first," Virginia replied. That was how it began. 6 days earlier, Virginia Dalton had been sitting at the window of her small house at the edge of Redemption Creek, watching the road with the particular practiced patience of a woman who has been waiting for something bad to happen for so long that she has started to wonder if the waiting itself has become the bad thing. It was the spring of 1878, New Mexico territory. The land around Redemption Creek was the kind of beautiful that does not apologize for itself. Red rock and sage, and sky so wide and blue it made your chest hurt if you looked at it too long. The town itself sat in a narrow valley where two dry creek beds crossed, and it had the look of a place that had not quite decided whether it wanted to survive. There was a hotel that doubled as a saloon, a livery stable, a church that held services only when the circuit preacher came through, a general store run by an old man named Mr. Hatch, and a scattering of houses belonging to the 30-odd families who had staked their futures on the idea that this particular piece of hard earth was worth staying for. Virginia had been one of those families once, when her husband, Robert Dalton, was alive. Robert had been a good man, or at least a man who tried to be good, and he had been dead now for 14 months after a horse fell on him during a flash flood. She was 26 years old and she was alone, and she had learned, in those 14 months, that the world had a very particular way of treating lone women on the frontier. There were men who offered help that was not really help. There were men who offered marriage the same way a trap offers shelter. There was a banker in the nearby town of Las Cruces who held the note on her small farm, and who had started sending letters with a tone she did not like. There was a foreman at the Whitmore cattle operation east of town named Clyde Barker who had taken to riding past her fence line more often than any legitimate business reason could explain. Virginia was not the kind of woman who panicked easily. She had grown up in Virginia, the state she was named after, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had put herself through a nursing course before it was fashionable. She could read Latin and she could dress a wound and she could make a week's worth of food out of things most people would throw away. She was dark-haired and brown-eyed, and she had a way of looking at people that made them feel she was seeing considerably more than they wanted her to see. She was not, as she would have freely admitted, a woman designed for helplessness. But she was tired, and that was the truth she kept pressed down underneath the daily work of surviving, the way you press a finger against a wound to keep it from bleeding. She saw Isaac Watkins ride into Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning in April. She saw him from the window because she always watched the road. He came in on a sorrel horse that had seen better days, a lean man in his early 30s with dark stubble, across a face that had been good-looking before whoever or whatever had tried their best to ruin it. He wore a battered hat and a coat that had been expensive once, and he rode with the particular posture of a man who has been in the saddle so long he cannot quite remember how to sit in a chair. He did not look dangerous exactly, but he looked like a man who knew where danger lived, which was both less comforting and more interesting than if he had simply looked dangerous. She watched him turn his horse toward the livery stable. She went back to her biscuit making. She did not think about him again until that afternoon when Mr. Hatch mentioned at the general store that there was a drifter in town who had paid 2 weeks in advance for a room at the hotel and asked if there was any work available. "Quiet fellow," Mr. Hatch said, with the approval of a man who has spent too much of his life listening to people who talk too much. "Paid in silver coin. Didn't smell of whiskey. Good signs." Virginia bought her flour and went home and did not think about the drifter again until the next morning, when she found him standing at the edge of her fence line, studying her barn with the focused attention of a man who understands what he is looking at. She went out to meet him the way she always met potential trouble, with her chin up and her voice level, and the sense that she was not going to be the first one to look away. "Can I help you?" she said. He turned, and up close his face was more interesting than it had been from a distance. Not handsome the way Robert had been handsome, which was a smooth, uncomplicated kind of handsome, but handsome the way landscape is handsome, all angles and weather and quiet purpose. His eyes were gray-green, and they looked at her with the same assessing quality she had noticed in her own eyes in mirrors, the look of someone who has learned the hard way that the world deserves a second and third inspection before you trust what it shows you on the first glance. "Your barn roof is going to fail," he said, without preamble. "Third beam from the left is cracked almost through. One heavy rain and you'll lose the whole south wall." Virginia looked at the barn. She had noticed something off about it 2 weeks ago and had been trying to find the money and the courage to hire someone to look at it. She looked back at the man. "You know barns," she said. "I know most things that can go wrong," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that was not quite a joke and not quite a confession but hovered somewhere between the two. "I'm Virginia Dalton," she said. "Isaac Watkins," he said, and he held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and respectful in the way she had learned to notice and appreciate, because respectful was not as common as it should have been. "Mr. Watkins, are you looking for work, or are you just in the habit of diagnosing other people's structural problems?" The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the beginning of what a smile might someday be with enough encouragement. "I heard in town that you might need help around the property. I have experience with carpentry, farm work, and horses." "And what else?" she said, because she could see he had left things out, the way a careful man always leaves the most important things out first. He looked at her steadily. "I am passing through, Mrs. Dalton. I am not looking for anything permanent, but I need work and you need that barn fixed before it falls in on whatever animals you're keeping in there." "2 horses and a milk cow," she said, And yes, you are right, I need the barn fixed. I cannot pay much. Fair pay is enough, he said. She hired him on a 3-day trial basis and showed him where the tools were kept and went back inside to watch from the window as he unloaded the barn's south end with the efficiency of a man who had done this kind of work many times before, in many different places, for many different people he never stayed with long enough to know. The 3-day trial became a week. The barn roof was repaired, and then the fence along the east pasture needed mending, and then one of the horses had a loose shoe that needed resetting, and Virginia was not a woman who spent time examining her own motivations too closely. But she knew that the fence along the west pasture had also needed mending for some time, and she had not mentioned it yet. And she knew why, and she kept that knowledge pressed down in the same place she kept her other quiet truths. Isaac Watkins was a man who worked without complaint, and without the kind of performance that some men put on when they want you to notice how hard they are working. He arrived every morning before 8, and he worked through to the heat of midday, and then he took a 30-minute rest in the shade of the big cottonwood by the creek, and then he worked again until the light failed. He ate the noon meal she brought out, and he said thank you with a sincerity that suggested the words were not just politeness, but a response to something he had not been given enough of. He did not ask personal questions. He answered her questions with a directness that was different from openness, the way a shuttered window is technically on the same wall as an open one, but gives you nothing of the room inside. She learned that he was from Missouri originally. She learned that he had been west for 7 years. She learned that he was 32 years old. She did not learn what he was running from because she had not yet asked, and he had not yet said. On the 5th day he stayed for supper because she asked him, mostly because the work he had done on the barn was so solidly, carefully excellent that she felt it demanded acknowledgement beyond wages, and partly because she had made too much rabbit stew and she did not want to eat alone, not again. He sat across the table from her in the small kitchen with its cast-iron stove and its shelves of canned goods and its single window that looked out toward the mountains turning purple in the evening light, and he ate her stew with the attentiveness of a man who takes his pleasures seriously precisely, because he has learned they do not come reliably. "How long has your husband been gone?" he asked, not as a probe but as an acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge the presence of something solid and real in a room. 14 months, she said. A flood. He was trying to save 2 horses and the water came faster than anyone expected. "I am sorry," he said, and she believed him. "And you?" She said, "Is there someone somewhere wondering where you are?" The pause that followed was the longest pause she had seen him take, which for any other man would not have been remarkable, but for this particular man was the equivalent of a door swinging open halfway and then stopping. "No," he said at last, "not anymore." She did not press. She refilled his coffee and they talked about other things. And when he left, he walked back down the road toward town in the dark, with the easy stride of a man who has learned to be comfortable with his own company, even when it is not the company he would choose. She stood at the window and watched him go and thought, with the clarity that comes in the space between one thought and the next, that she was in considerable danger of caring about this man, and that she should be more careful, and that she probably would not be. The next morning was when she went to the general store and found him with a gun against his chest. In the hours after the confrontation in Mr. Hatch's store, with the tall man delivered to the one-cell jail that constituted Redemption Creek's law enforcement under the watchful eye of a 60-year-old sheriff named Amos Webb, Virginia learned several things about Isaac Watkins in rapid succession, the way you sometimes learn everything about a place all at once during a storm. She learned that the 3 men were bounty hunters named Krell, Moss, and Durant, and that they had been following Isaac across the territory for close to 3 months. She learned that Isaac had not done what the bounty hunters were claiming he had done. She learned that what he was actually running from was not a crime he committed but a man he knew, a man named Harlan Voss, who was rich enough and connected enough and ruthless enough that the difference between what was true and what could be made to look true had long since ceased to matter. She did not learn all of this from Isaac himself. She learned the first parts from Sheriff Webb, who had his own prior knowledge of Krell and Durant as men of flexible ethics in the bounty hunting trade. She learned the rest in pieces over the next 2 days, mostly because she asked directly, and she had a way of asking directly that made evasion feel more exhausting than honesty. "Tell me about Harlan Voss," she said on the evening of the second day, sitting across from him in her kitchen again with the lamp lit between them and the sound of coyotes far off in the arroyos. Isaac looked at his hands on the table. They were carpenter's hands and farmer's hands, and she suspected, hands that had held a gun more than once in their time, and they were now very still. "He owns a cattle empire in southern Colorado," Isaac said, "or he did when I last knew him. He may have more by now, he tends toward more. And what is your connection to him?" "I worked for him," Isaac said, 7 years ago, as a foreman on his main operation. I was 25 years old and I thought the job was a job and Voss was a man who built what he had through hard work and smart dealing." He paused. "I was wrong about several things." Virginia waited. The lamp flame moved in a breath of air through the window. Voss was running cattle onto Comanche grazing land, systematically, with the backing of a federal land agent he had in his pocket. Families who had treaty rights to those lands were being pushed off them by force. 3 people died in incidents that Voss's people created, and then reported as something else entirely. Isaac's voice was flat and controlled in the way that flat and controlled voices always mean the opposite of calm underneath. "I found out. I went to a different federal agent with what I had. Within 2 weeks, Voss had turned that evidence into evidence against me, through connections I didn't know he had and money I could not compete with. The honest agent I had spoken to was reassigned to the Montana Territory. Voss had warrants issued for my arrest through channels I could not challenge without a lawyer I could not afford." "So you ran," Virginia said. "I ran," he said, and the way he said it was the way a man says a word that he has hated the shape of in his mouth for 7 years. "And Krell and Durant and the other one work for Voss. They work for whoever pays highest. Voss pays highest because he wants this resolved before it becomes something he cannot contain." Isaac looked up at her. "I have documents, evidence, the original things I gathered before I fled. I have kept them because I could not quite make myself burn them, even when it would have been safer to do so. I have them in my saddlebag. I have always told myself I was keeping them for the right moment. The right moment requires either a federal presence I can trust or a lawyer willing to take a case with no money attached to it." Virginia looked at him for a long time. He met her gaze with the steadiness of a man who is used to being looked at and found difficult. "There is a man in Santa Fe," she said at last, "a territorial attorney named Marcus Hale. He is friends with my father's cousin who lives there. Marcus Hale has a reputation for taking cases that involve federal land fraud because he lost his own family's homestead to a corrupt claim jumper 20 years ago. He is not soft about these things." Something moved across Isaac's face that was not quite hope, but was perhaps the space where hope might be allowed to exist if a person were careful and quiet about it. "I would need to get to Santa Fe," he said. "That is approximately 200 miles, Virginia said. "Yes. And Krell is in jail here, but Moss and Durant got away." "Yes. And Voss will send others when those 3 fail to report back." "He always does," Isaac said, with a weariness that was one of the most honest things she had ever heard from another human being. Virginia stood up and took the coffee cups to the basin and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking out the dark window at the pale strip of stars above the ridge. She thought about the banker in Las Cruces and his increasingly unfriendly letters. She thought about Clyde Barker riding past her fence. She thought about 14 months of sleeping alone in a house that was too quiet and working land that needed 2 people, and keeping herself going through a combination of stubbornness and the refusal to admit that she was frightened almost every single day. She thought about Isaac Watkins fixing her barn with the careful attention of a man who does excellent work in places he does not plan to stay. She turned around. "I have an aunt in Santa Fe," she said. "I have been meaning to visit for some time. I have a wagon and 2 horses, and I know the road through the Organ Mountains, which is the faster route. The banker who holds my note has given me until June, which is 8 weeks away. If I time this correctly, I can meet with Marcus Hale on your behalf and on my own, because frankly my situation with this note is something a good attorney might also be useful about, and I can be back before the deadline becomes a crisis." Isaac stared at her. "Mrs. Dalton, these men are dangerous." "I know that," she said. "I hit one of them with a skillet yesterday. That is not the kind of thing that discourages men like this." "Mr. Watkins," Virginia said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who has spent 14 months being told by the world in various ways what she cannot and should not do. "I am not asking your permission. I am telling you what I am planning to do, and I am suggesting that we would both be safer and more efficient if we did it together. You may of course decline and ride to Santa Fe on your own horse, and hope that Moss and Durant do not intercept you on the road, which they almost certainly will since there is only one main road south from here, and they know you are in this town. Or you may accompany me in my wagon, which will draw considerably less attention than a lone rider on a drifter's sorrel, and we will make better time with 2 people sharing the work of the journey." The silence that followed was the silence of a man recalibrating everything he has decided about how things are supposed to go. "You are a very particular kind of woman," Isaac said finally. "I have been told," Virginia replied. "We leave at first light on Thursday." They left at first light on Thursday. Virginia had packed with the efficiency of a woman who has learned that on the frontier you bring what you need and nothing else, and what you need is always less sentimental than you might wish. She had dried beans and salt pork and coffee and biscuit ingredients, and 2 good wool blankets and her father's old medical bag, and a map of the territory that was 3 years old but still basically accurate. She had a shotgun under the wagon seat, and she knew how to use it. She had left a note with Mr. Hatch about the property, and she had made arrangements with a neighbor woman named Clara Putnam to check on the livestock. Isaac rode his sorrel alongside the wagon for the first hour and then tied the horse to the back and climbed up onto the seat beside her, because the road south was rutted and slow, and it made more sense to share the driving, and she thought, watching him take the reins with the same quiet competence he applied to everything, that this was the most unplanned thing she had done in years, and that it did not feel as reckless as it perhaps should have. They did not talk much in the first morning. The landscape opened around them into the wide emptiness of the Chihuahuan Desert, which was not empty at all if you looked at it properly, but was rather full of ocotillo and cholla and roadrunners, and the particular kind of silence that makes you feel you are inside something very old and patient. The Organ Mountains rose ahead of them, all jagged peaks against the blue sky, and the road wound toward them with the patience of a thing that has been going there for a very long time. At noon they stopped by a dry arroyo where a cluster of cottonwoods meant there was water somewhere underground, and Virginia built a small fire and made coffee and heated beans, and they ate sitting a careful few feet apart on the shady side of the wagon. "Tell me something true," Virginia said. Isaac looked over at her with the wariness of a man who recognizes a tactic. "That is a broad request." "It is intended to be," she said. "We are going to spend at least 5 days in very close proximity on this road. I would rather know something real about you than spend 5 days making polite conversation about the weather." He was quiet for a moment, rolling his coffee cup between his palms. "I had a younger brother," he said finally, "Thomas. He died of fever when he was 17 and I was 20. I have been meaning to go back to Missouri to visit his grave for 12 years and I have not done it yet." He paused. "That is something true." Virginia felt the weight of it, the simple, particular sadness of a thing left undone for too long. "I am sorry," she said. "What is something true about you?" he said. She looked out at the mountains. "I loved my husband, but I am not sure I was in love with him, and I have felt guilty about that distinction for 14 months. He was a good man and he deserved a wife who was in love with him." She paused. "I think he knew." I think he accepted it because he was the kind of man who accepted things, which was both his greatest quality and the thing that sometimes made me want to shake him. Isaac looked at her with an expression that was very careful and very attentive. "You are an honest woman," he said. "It takes less energy than the alternative," she said, and poured more coffee. They broke camp and moved on, and the afternoon brought them to the foothills of the Organs, where the road narrowed and the rock walls rose on either side, and the sky became a ribbon of blue overhead. It was in this section, just after 3 in the afternoon, that Virginia noticed the dust cloud half a mile behind them that was moving faster than a dust cloud from the natural wind. "We have company," she said quietly. Isaac turned to look without making any obvious movement. His expression did not change, but his hands on the reins went careful. "Moss and Durant," he said. "They would have left Redemption Creek yesterday if they rode hard." He looked at the road ahead. "There is a fork about a mile on. Left goes deeper into the mountains. Right continues south toward Las Cruces. What do you know about the left fork?" "It leads to an old Apache trading route," Virginia said. "Rougher road, but it comes out 40 miles south of Las Cruces and cuts 2 days off the journey to Santa Fe if you know the way through." "Do you know the way through?" "My husband and I came that way once," she said. "I remember most of it. Then we take the left fork and we move as fast as this wagon can move," Isaac said. Virginia took back the reins. She was better on rough ground than he was, because she knew this particular rough ground, and she had grown up driving her father's wagon on roads that made this look like a city boulevard. She pushed the horses into a faster walk, and they made the left fork with 10 minutes to spare, turning into the canyon where the shadows were already deep, and the road was nothing more than a track between boulders. Moss and Durant, if they were following, would see their tracks. But the left fork split again half a mile in, and Virginia took the second split on instinct and memory. And after 20 minutes of increasingly rough going, they came out onto a shelf of rock above the main canyon, where the tracks below were visible, and their own were hidden by the stone surface. They stopped and waited in the long shadows of the late afternoon and watched 2 riders come through the canyon below at speed, following the main left fork, which took them deeper into the mountains and away from where Virginia and Isaac sat with the horses quiet and the world very still around them. When the riders had been gone for 15 minutes, Isaac let out a breath that seemed to have been held for quite some time. "You know this country," he said. "I paid attention," Virginia said. He looked at her, and in the fading afternoon light in that canyon, with the red walls all around them and the smell of sage rising in the cooling air, she saw something in his face that was not the careful flatness she had been reading for the past week. It was open and unguarded, and it was the face of a man looking at someone he has not expected to find. "Mrs. Dalton," he started. "Virginia," she said. "We are hiding from bounty hunters on a canyon shelf in the middle of the New Mexico territory. I think we are past Mrs. Dalton." He nodded slowly. "Virginia," he said, and the word in his mouth sounded different from the way other people said it, like he was saying it carefully because it mattered. They made camp on the shelf, because going back down in the dark was not sensible, and Virginia built a fire small enough to produce little smoke and big enough to keep the night chill off. They ate salt pork and biscuits and drank coffee under a sky so loaded with stars it seemed to bow under their weight, and Isaac told her about the 7 years of moving, the different towns, the different names he had used when the old name felt too dangerous, the different kinds of work, and the way a person gets used to not being known, and then starts to forget that being known was something they ever wanted. "Did you never think about fighting it?" she said. "From the beginning. Going back and fighting Voss directly." "Every day," he said, and every day the practical reality of what it would take made the thought smaller. He stared into the fire. "He has senators in his pocket. He has federal agents. He has money that turns any witness into a liability and any lawyer into a negotiation. What I have is a collection of documents in a saddlebag and 7 years of exhaustion." "You have the documents," she said. That is more than you think if the right person reads them. You make it sound simple. I make it sound possible, she said. Those are different things. He looked at her from across the fire and the expression was back, that open, unguarded thing, and she made herself look back at it steadily, because she had spent a great deal of her life being a woman who looked away at the exact moments when she most wanted to look. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You could have pointed me towards Santa Fe and gone back to your farm. These men are a danger to you now too, because of what you know and because you helped me in that store." "I know," she said. "Then why?" Virginia considered lying, which was the habitual move, or deflecting, which was the comfortable one, and then she considered telling the truth, which was what she had always been better at, even when it was inconvenient. "Because you looked at my barn and told me what was wrong with it when you had no reason to," she said. "Because you work like a man who takes pride in things even when nobody is watching. Because when those men had a gun on you, you were not afraid, you were just tired, and I recognized that, and I thought, this is a person who deserves to not be tired anymore." The fire moved between them. Something shifted in the desert air. "Virginia," he said, and then stopped, as if the thing he wanted to say was still in the process of finding its shape. "You do not have to say anything," she said. "I am not saying it to obligate you to anything. I am just saying it because it is true, and I am a woman who says true things. I know that about you," he said quietly. "It is one of the more terrifying things I have encountered in a considerable while." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her because it was genuine, the kind that comes from the place where things that are frightening and things that are wonderful are right next to each other. He watched her laugh with an expression that was dangerously close to tenderness. She went asleep wrapped in her wool blanket on the far side of the wagon, and he stayed by the fire keeping watch. And in the morning when she woke, he had coffee ready and the horses fed and watered from a canteen. And the morning was so purely itself, gold and clear and smelling of juniper, that she let herself have the simple pleasure of it without examining it too closely. They came down out of the mountains the next day on the old Apache route, which was rough going but entirely navigable with care, and by afternoon they were on the southern road headed toward Las Cruces. There was no sign of Moss and Durant, which meant either they had lost the trail entirely or they were ahead of them now, waiting, which was its own kind of problem. Isaac thought it was the latter. "Men like that think in predictable ways," he said. "They will have figured out we went through the mountains. They will have gotten ahead of us on the main road and they will be waiting somewhere between here and Santa Fe." "Las Cruces first," Virginia said. "I need to stop at the bank there." He looked at her. "The banker who holds your note. I would like to look him in the face," she said. "I have been afraid of his letters for months. I would like to go and look at the man behind them and see what he actually is." "And what do you think he actually is?" "A man who preys on widows," she said, and her voice was so flat and certain that it was more frightening than anger would have been. "And I would like him to understand that I have consulted with an attorney and am aware of the specific terms of the note and what his legal obligations are regarding extension, which I have read and he has been misrepresenting in his correspondence." Isaac looked at her for a long moment. "You know the law on this." "I know what my father's cousin Marcus wrote to me about it in November," she said. "I know enough. Your father's cousin Marcus is the attorney in Santa Fe." "Yes. You have been planning this trip longer than you let on," Isaac said. Virginia smiled at the road ahead. "I have been thinking about it," she said. "Your situation gave me the motivation to actually go." The smile that crossed his face then was the first full one she had seen from him, and it reorganized his face entirely. The weather and the angles and the careful control all giving way to something younger and warmer, and Virginia felt it in her chest like a bell being struck. Las Cruces was bigger than Redemption Creek, a proper town with a main street and a courthouse, and a hotel that served actual meals in a dining room. They arrived in the late afternoon and Virginia drove directly to the bank and left Isaac with the wagon and went inside with the letter from her cousin Marcus in her hand. The banker's name was Mr. Gerald Porterfield, and he was precisely what she had imagined, a soft man behind a hard desk who had built a career on the assumption that people in vulnerable situations would not push back. He looked at Virginia with the condescending patience of a man prepared for a supplication. She did not supplicate. She laid Marcus Hale's letter on his desk and explained, in the calm and exact tones of her schoolteacher father's daughter, that she was aware of the New Mexico Territorial Code regarding mortgage extension rights, that she had documented every payment she had made on time, that she was in communication with a territorial attorney who had a specific interest in cases of banking misconduct toward widows and homesteaders, and that she would appreciate a 6-month extension on the note at the existing interest rate, and that she was prepared to have Mr. Hale contact the Territorial Banking Commissioner if Mr. Porterfield felt he could not accommodate this request. Mr. Porterfield looked at the letter. He looked at Virginia. He looked at the letter again. She got the extension. She walked back out into the afternoon sun and climbed up onto the wagon seat, and Isaac looked at her and said, "Well, 6 months," she said. "I have 6 months." He was quiet for a beat, and then he said, "Remind me never to negotiate against you." "That would be wise," she agreed, and slapped the reins and drove them to the hotel. They had a good supper that night, the best meal either of them had eaten in some time. Roasted chicken and corn bread, and actual apple pie from a woman in the kitchen who apparently took her calling seriously. They ate at a corner table and talked about things that were not running or danger or bankers, about books they had read and places they had seen, and the particular beauty of the New Mexico sky. And Virginia thought that this was the most naturally she had sat with another person in years, maybe ever. And the thought of it was so surprising that she had to take a breath and look sideways at her own feelings the way you look sideways at something bright, so it does not hurt your eyes directly. After supper they sat on the hotel porch in the cooling night, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, not the empty kind, the kind that means two people have found a way to be still in the same space without having to fill it. "The last time I sat like this with someone," Isaac said, "was with Thomas, before the fever. We used to sit on the porch in Missouri in the evenings and just be quiet. He was the best company I ever had for quietness." "You miss him every day," Virginia said. "Yes," he said simply. "When this is over," she said, "you should go to Missouri, visit the grave, let yourself have that." He looked at the stars for a long moment. "When this is over," he repeated, as if the phrase had a shape he was not quite used to yet. The next morning they were on the road before sunrise, and 3 miles south of Las Cruces, right where the road curved through a stand of cottonwoods along the Rio Grande, they found Moss and Durant. The 2 men were waiting in the shade, their horses picketed in the trees, and they stepped into the road with their hands on their guns before Virginia, and Isaac had time to do more than register the movement. "End of the road," Moss said. He was shorter than Durant, with a face like a boot heel, all hard and flat. Isaac stopped the wagon. He was very still. "Watkins," Durant said from the other side. "Mr. Voss sends his regards." Virginia had the shotgun under the seat, and she was calculating the angle and the distance and whether she could reach it before either man fired, and the calculation was not going well, when something happened that she had not expected, and that would remain one of the more remarkable moments of her life. From the cottonwoods along the river, 4 men appeared. They were Apache men, mounted and silent, and their sudden presence in the cottonwood shadows was so complete and absolute that both Moss and Durant spun around with the reflex of men who have just understood that they have badly misjudged their situation. The oldest of the 4 Apache men rode forward. He was perhaps 50, with a face that carried the particular authority of a man who has earned it in hard currency. He looked at Moss and Durant, and he looked at Virginia and Isaac, and then he looked back at the 2 bounty hunters. "This is a road that many people use," he said, in clear and deliberate English. "Agreements made long ago say that the people on this road pass safely." These men, he indicated Moss and Durant, were here yesterday causing trouble with travelers who did not deserve it. We have been watching this road. We do not like what we have been seeing." Durant looked at his horse and then at the four mounted men and made what was, under the circumstances, the only sensible decision available to him, which was to not reach for his gun. "We were just leaving," Moss said. "Yes," said the Apache man. "You are." Moss and Durant untied their horses and rode north at a pace that accelerated steadily until they were out of sight. The Apache man watched them go and then turned back to Virginia and Isaac. "You are going to Santa Fe," he said to Virginia. "Yes," she said. "The road south of here is clear for the next 2 days' ride," he said. "After that you are close enough to the town that you will have safety in numbers." He looked at Isaac with the direct assessment of a man who has seen many kinds of people pass through his country. "Whatever trouble follows you, it ends here on this road." "Thank you," Virginia said, and she meant it with the full weight of the word. The man nodded. He and the 3 others turned their horses back toward the river and disappeared into the cottonwoods as completely as if the trees had simply taken them back. Isaac sat for a long moment without speaking. Then he said quietly, "I have spent 7 years trying to avoid notice of any kind, and in 6 days you have brought me the help of a banker's legal code, a canyon shelf, and 4 Apache men in a cottonwood grove." "People are often more helpful than expected," Virginia said, "if you treat them like people." He looked at her with an expression that was beyond the tenderness she had seen at the fire, something deeper and more particular, the expression of a man who is recognizing something he has been missing for so long he had stopped believing it existed. "Virginia," he said. "Isaac," she said. "I think I am." He stopped. "I know," she said softly. "I think I am too." He reached over and took her hand where it lay on the seat between them, and she turned her hand over and let their fingers lock together. And they sat like that for a moment in the cottonwood, shade by the Rio Grande, with the morning light coming through the leaves in pieces. 2 people who had both been running from different things, and had somehow managed to run into each other instead. Then Virginia picked up the reins with her free hand and clicked to the horses, and they drove south toward Santa Fe with their hands still joined. The road to Santa Fe was 5 more days of travel through a landscape that seemed to be making a point about scale and permanence. The Jornado del Muerto Plateau with its particular empty grandeur, the mountains rising in the northeast, the sky doing what New Mexico sky does, which is refuse to be anything less than overwhelming. They talked continuously in those 5 days, the kind of talking that 2 people do when they have been alone for too long and have finally found someone worth talking to, the kind that moves from the surface to the depth with the ease of water finding its level. Isaac told her about Missouri, about his father's farm and his mother's flower garden and Thomas's laugh, which had been the loudest laugh in any room. He told her about the years of working his way west, the cattle drives and the mining operations and the carpentry work, and the single year he had spent as a temporary schoolteacher in a small Colorado town when the regular teacher fell ill, which he recounted with such a mixture of warmth and mortification that Virginia laughed until she had to set down her coffee. Virginia told him about Virginia the state, about her father's schoolroom and the Greek and Latin texts on the shelves, and the way her mother had insisted that knowledge was the one thing nobody could take from you. She told him about the specific dreams she had come west with, a life of open space and self-determination that had been partially realized and partially complicated by the reality of what it meant to be a woman alone on the frontier. She told him about the loneliness, and she told it without drama, the way she told most things, which made it more affecting rather than less. On the 3rd night out of Las Cruces, they camped in the open beside a dry creek where the cottonwoods were sparse and the sky was enormous and the fire was small and bright, and Isaac looked at her across it with that expression she had learned by now, the one that meant he was deciding something. "When I was in Redemption Creek," he said, "and those men had the gun on me, I told you I was tired of running." "I remember," she said. "Those were the last words you said before I hit the man with the skillet." "I meant them," he said, But I did not know in that moment what stopping would look like. I have been running for so long that I thought stopping just meant dying. I thought there was no version of stop that wasn't also an ending. He paused. I am starting to think differently about that. Virginia looked at him. The fire was between them, but it was a small fire. What are you thinking differently? She said. I am thinking that stopped could also be the beginning of something, he said. That there is a version of this where I stand still in one place and build something and tend it and stay. He looked at her directly. With someone. The word landed in the air between them and stayed there. Isaac, she said carefully, we have known each other for 12 days. I know, he said. I am not asking anything. I am telling you the direction of my thoughts so that you can decide what to do with that information. That is a very particular kind of honesty, she said. I have been spending time with a woman who says true things, he said. It appears to be contagious. Virginia looked at the fire. She looked at the stars. She looked at the shape of him across the fire, this man who had fixed her barn and hidden her on a canyon shelf, and held her hand on a road by a river, this man who had spent 7 years being a ghost of himself in the service of a safety that was never quite safe enough. I think, she said slowly, that the direction of my thoughts is in the same general direction as yours. I think I have been alone long enough that I had started to confuse aloneness with strength, and I think you reminded me that accepting help is not weakness. I think you are a good man and a careful man and a man who does excellent work in places he was not planning to stay. She paused. I am also saying I am not asking anything. I'm just saying the direction. He smiled at her, that full warm smile, and the fire moved between them in the night air. Same direction then, he said. Same direction, she agreed. They arrived in Santa Fe on a Thursday morning, dusty and trail-worn, and more at ease with each other than people have any right to be after 12 days in a wagon. And Virginia drove directly to the address her cousin had given her because she was not a person who delayed necessary things. Marcus Hale's office was on the second floor of a building near the plaza, a bright, book-lined room presided over by a compact, energetic man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the manner of someone who has spent a career being underestimated and learned to use it as a professional advantage. He embraced Virginia with the warmth of genuine family and shook Isaac's hand, and listened for 2 hours while they laid out everything. The documents from the saddlebag spread across his desk, the history of Harlan Voss and the land fraud and the corrupt warrants, and the 7 years of running. Marcus Hale read the documents with the intensity of a scholar finding primary sources, making small sounds of satisfaction at certain passages that suggested he recognized exactly what he was looking at. When he had finished, he took off his spectacles and looked at Isaac with an expression that was professional and precise. "These are extraordinary," he said. "The land survey records a loan, combined with the treaty documentation and the witness affidavit you collected from the Comanche headman, are a federal case by themselves. The fact that Voss managed to turn this into warrants against you says everything about his connections and nothing about the actual law." He paused. "I have a colleague in the federal attorney's office in Denver. He has been building a separate case against Voss for land fraud in Colorado for the past 2 years. What you have here fills in the southern half of a picture he very much wants completed." Isaac sat very still. "You are saying this can be prosecuted?" "I am saying," Marcus said carefully, "that with these documents and a coordinated approach between my office, the Denver federal attorney, and the specific federal judge in the 8th Circuit who has a documented interest in land treaty violations, this becomes a case that Voss's money will find considerably harder to quietly dissolve than the original complaint you filed 7 years ago." He looked at Isaac steadily. "It will take time. It will require you to provide testimony. It will require you to be in one place long enough to be found by people on your side as well as people on his. Are you prepared for that?" Isaac looked at Virginia. She looked back at him. The look was brief and complete, the kind that happens between two people when they have arrived at a shared understanding without having to take it apart word by word. Yes, Isaac said. I am. Marcus Hale began writing letters that afternoon. He wrote to the federal attorney in Denver, and he wrote to a judge he knew, and he wrote to a federal land commissioner who had been waiting for a case like this for years. He also spent an hour with Virginia reviewing the terms of her note with the Las Cruces Bank and confirming that the extension she had obtained was legally sound and that Porterfield had no further grounds for pressure. And when he was done, he sent Virginia's cousin, his wife Eleanor, to take her to the family house for supper and a proper bed. Virginia slept that night in a real bed in a quiet room, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about the last 13 days, and the particular way that a life can change its direction in the space of a few words and a skillet and a canyon shelf, and a hand on a seat between two people who have both been tired of running, just in different ways. Isaac stayed at a boarding house near the plaza and spent 3 days giving formal statements to Marcus Hale and writing out everything he remembered in the specific, documented way that Marcus required. On the second evening, he found Virginia in the small garden behind her cousin's house, where she had been helping Eleanor plant spring vegetables in the red Santa Fe earth. He stood at the garden gate and she looked up from the row she was working, and they smiled at each other the way people smile when they have missed someone they had not fully admitted they would miss. Marcus thinks the Denver attorney will respond within 2 weeks, he said. He wants me to stay in Santa Fe for the initial correspondence. You are staying in one place, she said. I am staying in one place, he confirmed, and the way he said it was the way someone says a thing that is a promise to themselves. Virginia stood up, brushing the red dirt from her hands. Eleanor has been asking me to stay longer, she said. I have the barn in good repair and Clara Putnam will look after the livestock, and I have 6 months before the bank deadline. I think I might stay a few more weeks. Isaac looked at her, and the open, unguarded expression was fully present now, no longer startling because she had learned the shape of it and its particular quality of warmth. Virginia, he said, I told you the direction of my thoughts. I would like to know if the direction has held steady. She came to the gate and looked up at him in the clear Santa Fe evening. It has held very steady, she said. He took her hand the way he had taken it on the road by the Rio Grande, and this time there was nothing provisional about it. I have been running from the possibility of a home, he said, because every place I stopped felt temporary, and every person I talked to felt like someone I was going to have to leave. I have never, he stopped and started again, and she could see it in his face, this man who was not practiced at saying the things that most needed saying. I have never been in a place with a person where stopping felt possible. You make stopping feel possible. You fixed my barn, she said simply. Everything else came from that. He laughed, the full, warm laugh she had learned from the smile, and she thought she could listen to that laugh for a very long time and not find it anything less than perfect. He kissed her there at the garden gate, the first kiss, and it was the kind that is not tentative because the people involved are past tentative. It has the quality of an arrival, two people who have been traveling a long time recognizing that they have reached where they were going. Eleanor appeared at the back door of the house and observed this development with the satisfaction of a woman who has been watching two people be carefully polite about their feelings for 2 weeks and is glad to see an end to it. You are both staying for supper, she said, and I will not hear otherwise. The weeks in Santa Fe settled into a pattern that Virginia had not experienced before, the particular texture of days that have both purpose and pleasure in them simultaneously. She helped Eleanor in the garden. She read Marcus's law books in the evenings. She walked through the plaza in the mornings with the easy stride of a woman who is not managing anything for once, just moving through a morning because it is a good morning to be in. And she spent time with Isaac, an increasing amount of it, and the time was the kind that builds on itself, conversation that deepens and expands, silences that become more comfortable rather than less, the accumulation of shared small moments that are the actual architecture of a life together. She learned that he was a careful cook when given access to a proper kitchen, that he read voraciously when there were books available, that he had strong and somewhat unconventional views about irrigation as a factor in territorial land disputes, and that he had an endearing tendency to underestimate himself in matters not related to practical skill, which she took as a project. He learned that she could be stubborn to the point of genuine inconvenience, that she had a gift for reading people that was occasionally unsettling, that she possessed an unexpected and completely sincere passion for botany, and could name most of the plants they encountered on their walks with both their common and Latin designations, and that she cried when she was angry rather than when she was sad, which had caused her considerable professional difficulty over the years. "I know when I am being cried at," he told her one afternoon. "You do not have to apologize for it." "I am not apologizing," she said, who had not been apologizing, only explaining. "I am contextualizing." "There is very little difference from the outside," he said, and caught the look she gave him and grinned. The response from Denver came in the third week, a long and energized letter from the federal attorney, a man named Solomon Barnes, who had indeed been building a case against Harlan Voss, and who described Isaac's documents as the missing foundation of an argument he had been unable to make without them. Barnes wanted Isaac to come to Denver as soon as possible to coordinate testimony and provide formal declarations before the federal grand jury that Barnes was in the process of assembling. Marcus Hale read the letter with the careful pleasure of a man who has put together a complicated puzzle and had the last piece arrive by post. "The warrants against you," Marcus told Isaac that evening, with Virginia sitting across the table listening with the alertness she brought to everything, "can be challenged directly in the Eighth Circuit as improperly issued, particularly given the documented conflict of interest of the federal agent who processed them. I will file that motion in parallel with the Denver proceedings. It will take several months to work through, but the trajectory is clear." "Clear meaning what exactly?" Isaac said. "Clear meaning Harlan Voss is going to have a very unpleasant year," Marcus said, with the understated satisfaction of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something like that. "And you, Mr. Watkins, are going to be able to put your own name on a door again." Isaac was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Virginia, who was watching him with those dark eyes that saw everything. "I need to go to Denver," he said. "I know," she said, "and you need to go back to Redemption Creek." "I do," she said. "The farm does not look after itself indefinitely." "This is not a goodbye," he said, and the statement was so direct and clear and entirely without qualification that she felt it all the way to the center of her chest. "No," she said, "it is not. They made plans at that table in Marcus Hale's book-lined office, practical plans of the kind that belong to people who are serious about a shared future. Isaac would go to Denver. Virginia would return to Redemption Creek. Marcus would keep them both informed of developments. When the legal situation had progressed to a stable point, which Marcus estimated at 4 to 6 months, Isaac would return to Redemption Creek. After that, they would figure out the next thing together. "Together," Isaac said, making it official in the way that things said aloud between honest people become official. "Together," Virginia agreed. They had 3 more days in Santa Fe before Virginia needed to start back, and they spent them with the fullness of people who understand that they are laying a foundation rather than saying a farewell. They had supper every night at a leaner's table. They walked every morning through the plaza. They sat in the evenings on the courtyard bench outside the house and talked about everything they were going to do, the farm and the land, and what it would look like with 2 people working it instead of 1. On the last evening, sitting in the courtyard with the Santa Fe sky going from orange to purple to the particular blue that comes just before the stars appear, Isaac said something she had not expected. "I have kept those documents in my saddlebag for 7 years," he said. "I have carried them across Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Texas. I told myself I was keeping them for the right moment." He looked at her. I think the right moment required not just the right legal situation, but the right person to make me believe the right moment was actually possible. Virginia looked at the sky and then at him. You were always going to be brave enough, she said. You just needed somewhere to be brave toward. He took her hand. They sat like that until the stars were fully out and a leaner called them in for coffee, and the night was gentle around the old adobe walls of the house. Virginia left for Redemption Creek the next morning. Isaac stood at the edge of the plaza and watched her drive the wagon around the corner, and she did not look back because, if she had, she would have stopped the wagon, and she had a farm to get to, and she was not a woman who made things harder than they needed to be, even when they were already hard. She made the journey back in 5 days, traveling with a wagon train party she joined in Las Cruces, which was both safer and lonelier than the journey south had been. She arrived at her farm on a Wednesday afternoon to find the livestock well tended by Clara Putnam, and the barn roof precisely as solid as Isaac had made it. And she stood in the yard for a moment looking at it, and thought about how much had changed since she had last stood in this exact spot, and how much of it was invisible from the outside. She wrote to Isaac that evening, the first of what became a correspondence carried by the twice-monthly postal rider through the territory, letters that were both practical and honest and entirely themselves, which is to say they were like their author, and were treated with great care by their recipient. She learned, over the following months, how to read the legal situation through the updates Marcus sent. She learned that the Eighth Circuit had granted the challenge to the warrants and suspended them pending review. She learned that the federal grand jury in Denver had indicted Harlan Voss on 17 counts of land fraud, treaty violation, and the corruption of federal officials. She learned that 2 of the 3 bounty hunters, Moss and Durant, had been arrested in Albuquerque on separate warrants entirely unrelated to Isaac, which suggested the universe had a sense of proportion. She also learned, in the same months, how to read her own heart, which was not a document she had given much attention to in the past several years. She learned that she was in love with Isaac Watkins in the particular, complete, non-provisional way that she had previously suspected she was not capable of, and the discovery was both humbling and exhilarating in equal measure. She planted her kitchen garden in late April, and she broke the east field for summer planting, and she made repairs to the chicken coop, and she negotiated successfully with a neighboring rancher for seasonal water rights, and all of it was work she was good at and proud of, and none of it was as good as it would be with Isaac there. His letters were extraordinary. She had not expected that, because she had read him as a man of few words, which he was in speech, but in writing he was something else entirely, precise and warm and full of the observations of a man who pays close attention to everything he moves through. He wrote her about Denver, about the mountains above the city, about the courtroom where he had given testimony against a man he had feared for 7 years, which he described with the quiet pride of someone who has finally done the thing they were always going to have to do. He wrote about Thomas and about Missouri, and about what he thought a farm in the Redemption Creek Valley might look like if it were given proper water management and a south-facing kitchen garden. He wrote about her, toward the end of letters, with a directness that was characteristic, and that made her read those passages more than once in the lamplight of her small house. In July, Marcus Hale wrote to tell her that the warrants against Isaac had been officially dismissed by the Eighth Circuit, citing fraudulent issuance, and that Isaac was, for the first time in 7 years, a man without a legal cloud over his name. In August, Marcus wrote again to say that Harlan Voss had accepted a plea agreement in the federal case to avoid a full trial, had agreed to forfeit a significant portion of his land holdings, and that the territory was in the process of acknowledging the treaty violations and working toward restoration of grazing rights to the affected communities. It was not a perfect resolution, Marcus acknowledged, because such things rarely were, but it was a substantial and documented one, and the people most harmed by Voss's actions would at least have their legal standing recognized. Virginia read that letter at her kitchen table and thought about the headman in the cottonwoods by the Rio Grande, and hoped the news would reach the people who needed to hear it. And then in late August, a letter came from Isaac that said simply that the legal matter was concluded and that he was coming to Redemption Creek, and that he would arrive in approximately 3 weeks, and that he had some questions he would like to ask her that he preferred to ask in person rather than by post. She read that letter 3 times. Then she went out and started expanding the garden. Isaac Watkins rode into Redemption Creek on a Friday afternoon in mid-September, 1878, on a new horse, a solid bay gelding that suggested a man who has recently had access to real wages and made sensible choices with them. He looked different in the ways that matter, not different in his face or his bearing, but different in some quality of his presence. The exhaustion that had been his most defining characteristic for 7 years was gone, replaced by something that was not quite its opposite but was close, a kind of settled steadiness, the look of a man who has stood his ground and found it solid. Virginia was in the yard when he came down the road. She had not staged this. She was genuinely in the yard because the yard needed work, and she was a woman who did the work that needed doing regardless of what else might be happening. But she had been aware for about 20 minutes that she was listening for hooves. He stopped the horse at the fence and looked at her over it. She looked back at him. The afternoon light was the golden September kind that New Mexico does better than anywhere else, and it made everything it touched look like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. "Hello," he said. "Hello," she said. "I have some questions," he said. "You mentioned that," she said. He dismounted and tied the horse to the fence post and came through the gate, and when he reached her, he took both her hands in his and stood looking at her with the full, open expression she had been looking forward to for 5 months, and that was, in person, even better than in memory. "I told you I had been running from this my whole life," he said. "Not from Voss, not from the warrants, from this, from the possibility of a place I stayed, from the possibility of a person I was honest with, from the possibility of building something that required me to be present every day." He looked at her steadily. "I have been running from this my whole life, but not anymore." Virginia looked at him, this tired drifter who was no longer tired, this man who had crossed half a territory with her and carried his truth in a saddlebag for 7 years and learned to smile fully again somewhere between a canyon shelf and a garden gate. "Is that one of the questions?" she said. "No," he said. "The question is whether you would be willing to marry me. The other part was a preamble." Virginia laughed, and the laugh was the genuine kind, the kind that comes from the place where things that are frightening and things that are wonderful live together. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. I expanded the garden." He looked past her at the noticeably larger garden plot. "Is that what that means?" "I'm a practical woman," she said. "I respond to developments practically." He kissed her, there in the yard of the farm she had held together alone for 14 months, with the barn roof solid above them and the mountains on the horizon and the particular New Mexico light turning everything golden. And this kiss had the same quality as the one at the garden gate in Santa Fe, the quality of arrival, of coming home to a place you did not know you were looking for. They were married 6 weeks later in the Redemption Creek Church on a Saturday morning when the circuit preacher happened to be in town, which Virginia later described as the most convenient scheduling in the history of the New Mexico Territory. Mr. Hatch closed the store for the morning. Clara Putnam brought pies. Sheriff Amos Webb attended and expressed the gruff satisfaction of a man who has seen enough bad endings to appreciate a good one. Eleanor and Marcus Hale made the trip from Santa Fe and sat in the front pew with the contentment of people whose role in a story has turned out to be important. Isaac wore a new coat and a clean shirt and looked like a man who has made a decision. He has no intention of reconsidering. Virginia wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool that was the exact color of the New Mexico sky on the kind of day when the sky is making a point, and her dark hair was up, and she had flowers from the garden pinned at her shoulder, and she looked like a woman who has finally arrived at the life she always intended to have. They said their vows with the directness and the sincerity that characterized everything they did, and when it was over they walked out into the September afternoon with their hands joined, and the town of Redemption Creek, all 30-odd families of it, made enough noise to suggest that the name of the town had been, all along, more prophetic than anyone had intended. In the years that followed, Redemption Creek grew, the way small towns in the territory were growing in those years as the railroad came closer, and the cattle trade expanded, and more families found their way to the valley. Isaac found work in construction and carpentry, and eventually established what became the most reliably excellent building operation in that part of the territory, a business that grew with the town, and that he ran with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He was known as a man who did excellent work and charged a fair price and kept his word, and in a place and time when those qualities were not as common as they should have been, his reputation was a substantial thing. Virginia expanded the farm systematically, adding chickens and then a larger vegetable operation, and eventually a small greenhouse structure Isaac built for her against the south wall of the barn, which she used year-round with the focused enthusiasm of a woman who has finally found the practical application for a lifelong passion for botany. She also became, quietly and without any particular announcement, the person in Redemption Creek who people went to when they needed help with a legal question, a medical matter, or simply a clear-eyed reading of a situation that had become complicated. She had not set out to be this, but she had the skills and the willingness and the specific reputation for seeing more than she showed, and the town used her accordingly. They wrote to Marcus Hale regularly, and Marcus kept them informed as the land restoration process moved forward in the South, slowly and imperfectly but forward, which Marcus maintained was the most you could expect from any legal process and more than most produced. In the spring of 1880, their son was born, a boy they named Thomas, after the brother whose grave Isaac had finally visited the previous autumn on a trip back to Missouri that Virginia had insisted on making with him, standing with him in the quiet of the churchyard in the green Missouri morning, while he did the thing he had been meaning to do for 12 years, and holding his hand while he did it. The Thomas they named their son after would have liked that, Virginia thought, a nephew carrying his name into the western country. Thomas was followed, 2 years later, by a daughter they named Eleanor, after the cousin whose garden had been the site of a certain garden gate moment that neither of them had forgotten. Eleanor Watkins arrived in the world with the same dark eyes as her mother, and the same steady hands as her father, and a disposition that suggested she intended to have opinions about everything, which was regarded by both her parents as a highly promising start. And in the evenings in those years, when the work was done and the children were asleep, and the house was full of the particular quiet that comes from being full rather than empty, Isaac and Virginia sat on the porch of the house that Isaac had built with his own hands on the land she had held with her own stubbornness, and looked at the mountains going purple against the darkening sky, and were present in the precise, deliberate way that people are present when they understand what being present is worth. "You know," Virginia said one evening in the fall of 1882, watching a hawk circle above the ridge in the last of the light, "I have been thinking about the road between here and Santa Fe." "A subject with good associations," Isaac said. "I have been thinking about the section through the Organ Mountains, the old Apache route. I think there may be a better road possible through that canyon, and if it were properly graded, it would take a full day off the journey to Las Cruces." Isaac looked at her with the comfortable suspicion of a man who knows that when his wife says she has been thinking about something, the full dimensions of the thought are considerably larger than the opening statement suggests. "And," he said, "and I have been corresponding with the Territorial Road Commission," she said, "and with the Apache headman whose people actually know that route better than anyone. And with Marcus, who thinks there is a federal road improvement allocation that could be applied if the right petition were made by the right parties. Isaac was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been working on this?" "Several months," she said. "When were you planning to tell me?" "I am telling you now," she said. "I need a contractor who knows the terrain." He looked at her. The hawk had found its thermal and was rising now, circling higher and higher above the ridge until it was a small dark shape against the first stars appearing in the east. "Virginia Watkins," he said, "I will never in my life be bored." "No," she agreed, "you will not." He laughed, the full warm laugh that still reorganized his face entirely, and she leaned into his shoulder in the way she had settled into the habit of, natural as breathing, and they sat in the cooling evening with the mountains and the stars, and the particular quality of silence that means a life is exactly what it should be. The road through the Oregon Mountains was built the following year, a proper graded road following the old Apache route that Marcus Hale's petition had secured funding for. It cut the journey between Redemption Creek and Las Cruces by a full day, and it was used by everyone in the valley for decades afterward, and it was known locally, informally, as the Watkins Road, though neither Isaac nor Virginia had asked for that name, and both of them were somewhat embarrassed by it, which their neighbors found charming. Isaac Watkins was a man who had spent 7 years being a ghost of himself, moving through places without leaving a mark, keeping his name off everything, staying only long enough to leave no trace. In Redemption Creek, he left every possible kind of trace. His building stood for generations. His name was on contracts and deeds and church records, and the charter of the school board he helped establish in 1884. His children carried his steadiness and his wife's fire in equal measure, and grew up knowing exactly who they were and where they came from. He went back to Missouri once more, in 1885, to deal with his late father's estate and to stand again at Thomas's grave, this time with his own Thomas, 8 years old, and already showing the particular quality of close attention that his father and grandfather had both possessed, standing seriously next to the grave of an uncle he would never meet, and asking careful questions about the man who rested there. Isaac answered every question, and afterward they walked through the town where he had grown up, and he showed his son the house and the school and the places that made him, and they ate supper at a hotel and took the train back west. And Isaac watched the Missouri landscape give way to Kansas and Kansas to Colorado and Colorado to New Mexico. And when the train came around the bend above the Redemption Creek Valley, and the town came into view below, spread out along the 2 dry creek beds with the church steeple and the new school and the building operations he could identify from this distance, and the farm at the edge of town with the south-facing greenhouse glinting in the afternoon light, he felt what he had not felt anywhere for 32 years, which was the complete and specific feeling of coming home. Virginia was waiting at the station with Alina on her hip, because Alina at 3 was still in the stage of preferring to be carried when something interesting was happening, and she looked up at Isaac as he came down from the platform with his son beside him, and she smiled the smile that he thought of as the one that was entirely for him, not the competent smile she gave to legal questions, or the warm smile she gave to neighbors, or the specifically gleeful smile she gave to plants that were doing what she intended, but the one with the particular light in it that he had first seen across a campfire in a canyon, and that was the truest thing he knew. He kissed her and lifted Alina from her arms and felt Thomas press against his side, and looked around at the town and the valley and the mountains above, and thought, with the clean and absolute certainty of a man who has arrived exactly where he is supposed to be, that he had been running from this his whole life, and that stopping had been the best thing he had ever done.